"Sir, you'll need to move." The sentence landed flat and final, like a stamp pressed onto something already decided. And for a moment, the entire first-class cabin seemed to inhale at once, then hold it, as if even the recycled air understood that something was off. Not loud, not dramatic, just quietly wrong. Marcus Ellington didn't look up right away, his fingers still resting on the keyboard of a worn silver laptop. The glow of the screen reflecting faintly in his glasses, a half-written email paused mid-sentence. Cursor, blinking like a metronome counting out a decision he hadn't made yet. While outside the oval window the late afternoon sky stretched endless and pale over the Midwest, 35,000 feet above a world that suddenly felt much smaller. The flight attendant, Claire Donovan, stood just to his right, posture straight, smile practiced but tight at the edges, her hand hovering politely near the armrest as if she could guide him out of the seat without ever touching him, and behind her, a man in a tailored Navy suit, Daniel Whitmore, waited with the kind of still impatience that didn't need words, his leather carry-on angled beside his leg, his gaze already claiming the space before he'd even stepped into it. Marcus finally lifted his eyes, calm, steady, the kind of calm that didn't come from not understanding what was happening, but from understanding it too well, and for a second their eyes met, his quiet, hers flickering, before she repeated, softer this time. "We just need to accommodate another passenger." And somewhere across the aisle a seatbelt clicked open, someone shifting to get a better look, while a man 2 rows back lowered his newspaper just enough to watch without being obvious. Marcus's hands moved slowly, deliberately, closing the laptop with a soft click that sounded louder than it should have in the hush that had settled over the cabin, the overhead lights casting a cool, even glow across polished armrests and pressed fabrics. Everything orderly, everything controlled, except for the tension threading invisibly between rows 2 and 3. He glanced briefly at his boarding pass, still tucked into the seat pocket, the bold first class, printed clearly, then back up at Claire, not defensive, not confrontational, just present, as if he were placing a single question carefully onto the table between them. And when he spoke, his voice was low, measured, carrying just far enough for those closest to hear. "Is this about policy or preference?" The words didn't rise, didn't accuse, but they shifted something subtle and immediate, like a hairline crack running through glass. Claire hesitated, just a fraction too long, her training pulling one way, the moment pulling another, while Daniel exhaled through his nose, a faint, dismissive sound, his cufflinks catching the light as he adjusted his sleeve, already impatient with the delay, already certain of the outcome. Around them, the cabin remained still, conversations paused mid-sentence, drinks untouched on fold-out trays, a quiet audience gathered without moving, and Marcus sat there in that seat, upright, composed, unmistakably belonging and yet being asked to leave, as the hum of the engines filled the silence, steady and indifferent, carrying them forward while, for just a few suspended seconds, everything inside the cabin seemed to stop. Marcus did not move immediately after asking the question, and that stillness carried its own weight, heavier than any raised voice could have. His posture relaxed but grounded, shoulders level, hands resting lightly on the closed laptop, as if anchoring himself to something steady beneath the quiet tension that had begun to ripple through the cabin. While Claire's expression shifted in small, almost imperceptible ways, the practiced professionalism still there, but now edged with uncertainty. Her eyes flicking briefly toward Daniel, as if searching for confirmation that the moment would resolve itself the way these moments usually did, quickly, quietly, without resistance. Marcus's clothing did not announce anything extraordinary. A simple dark jacket, a clean but unbranded shirt, the kind of attire that did not demand attention yet carried a quiet precision, everything fitting exactly as it should. And on his wrist a watch that was understated but unmistakably refined to anyone who noticed such details, though most people did not, because they were not looking for signs of who he was, only for reasons to justify what they were seeing. A woman across the aisle shifted in her seat, her fingers tightening slightly around a paper cup of coffee, the lid trembling just enough to betray the tension she would not voice, while a young man a few rows back glanced between Marcus and Daniel with a hesitant curiosity, as if trying to piece together a story from fragments he did not fully understand. And in that suspended space, no one spoke, but everyone was listening. Daniel stepped half a pace forward, not close enough to touch, but close enough to assert presence, his voice low but carrying. "I believe there has been a mix-up," he said, though there was no confusion in his tone, only expectation, the kind that came from a lifetime of doors opening before he reached them. And Claire nodded quickly, grateful for the direction. "Yes, sir. We are simply trying to resolve a seating arrangement," she added, her words carefully neutral, though the imbalance beneath them was anything but. Marcus's gaze remained steady, not fixed on Daniel, not fixed on Claire, but somewhere between them, as if he were observing the situation rather than reacting to it. And when he finally spoke again, his voice did not rise, did not sharpen. It remained even, deliberate. "I selected this seat. I confirmed it this morning. I boarded with this assignment." Each sentence placed with quiet clarity, not defensive, not emotional, just factual. And that precision seemed to slow the moment even further, stretching it thin. Claire inhaled, a controlled breath, then gestured subtly toward the aisle. "There is another seat available in the main cabin," she said, the phrasing gentle, almost apologetic, but the implication unmistakable. And for a brief second, something flickered across Marcus's face, not anger, not surprise, but recognition, as if he had seen this exact moment before in a different place, under different lights, wearing different clothes, yet carrying the same unspoken message. The engines continued their steady hum, the faint vibration traveling through the floor beneath their feet, a constant reminder that the aircraft was moving forward regardless of what unfolded inside it. And Marcus's hand lifted slightly, not in refusal, not in acceptance, but in pause, his fingers brushing the edge of the armrest as he leaned back just enough to take in the cabin. The rows of wide seats, the polished surfaces, the controlled quiet, and the people who now watched without admitting they were watching. And then he looked back at Claire, his expression unchanged, calm but unyielding, as if he were holding a line that could not be seen, yet could not be crossed without consequence. Daniel let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like a laugh, though there was no humor in it, only a thin layer of disbelief wrapped in entitlement, his eyes scanning Marcus from head to toe with the kind of quick judgment that did not ask questions, only reached conclusions, and he tilted his head slightly, as if adjusting his view might somehow make the situation align with his expectations. "Look," he said, voice smooth but edged, "we are all trying to get where we need to go." And the word "we" lingered just long enough to draw a line that did not need to be spoken out loud. Claire shifted her weight subtly, her shoes pressing into the carpeted aisle, the narrow space suddenly feeling even tighter as the moment stretched, and she glanced toward the front galley where a supervisor stood partially visible behind a curtain, watching, not intervening yet, but aware, always aware, and that awareness began to spread through the cabin like a quiet signal, flight attendants exchanging brief looks, passengers pretending not to notice while noticing everything. Marcus did not respond immediately, and in that pause there was no hesitation, only control, as if he were choosing not just his words but the weight they would carry when they landed, his gaze steady, not confrontational, not submissive, simply present in a way that made it difficult to ignore him. And when he finally spoke, it was not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "I understand that," he said, his tone even. "But I also understand that I purchased this seat, and I was assigned this seat, and I boarded with this seat." Each repetition deliberate, not redundant, reinforcing a boundary that had already been crossed once. Daniel's expression tightened, just slightly, the corners of his mouth pulling into something less controlled, his patience thinning not because he had been challenged loudly, but because he had been challenged calmly, and that unsettled him more. "Sometimes accommodations have to be made," he replied, the words carrying a quiet authority that assumed agreement, as if the decision had already been accepted and this conversation was merely a formality. A man seated diagonally behind Marcus leaned back, arms crossed loosely, his eyes flicking between the two men, while a woman near the window adjusted her seatbelt strap slowly, the soft click echoing faintly in the stillness, small sounds becoming amplified in the absence of normal conversation. Claire cleared her throat gently, stepping slightly closer, lowering her voice as if proximity could soften the request. "Sir." "We do appreciate your understanding," she said, though nothing about Marcus's expression suggested confusion that required understanding, and for a brief second, her words hung in the air without landing. Marcus's fingers tapped once against the closed lid of his laptop, not impatient, just thoughtful, and he leaned back a fraction, his shoulders settling against the seat, as if he were becoming more rooted rather than preparing to leave, and his eyes moved briefly toward the aisle, then back to Claire, then to Daniel, taking in the arrangement of people, positions, expectations. And something in that observation seemed to shift the balance ever so slightly, not outwardly, not yet, but enough that the certainty in Daniel's posture no longer felt absolute. The hum of the engines continued, steady and distant, the aircraft cutting through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour while inside. Time felt suspended, stretched between a request that had been made and a response that had not yet been given. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, composed, unmoved, as if the seat beneath him had become more than just a place to sit, as if it had become a line drawn quietly, firmly, in a space where lines were not supposed to be questioned. The supervisor stepped forward at last, parting the thin curtain with a quiet motion that seemed louder than it should have been, his presence carrying a different kind of weight, not louder, not harsher, but more official, the kind that suggested decisions rather than discussions. And as he approached, the subtle shift in the cabin became undeniable. Conversations that had not yet resumed now felt fully suspended, every nearby passenger aware that something was about to resolve, one way or another. His name tag read Andrew Collins, polished and precise, and his posture mirrored the airline's brand more than his own personality, straight-backed, controlled, measured, as if every movement had been practiced in front of a mirror until it conveyed exactly the right amount of authority without crossing into confrontation. And when he spoke, his tone followed that same line. "Sir, I understand there has been a misunderstanding regarding seating," he began, his voice calm, even, carrying just enough to be heard by those closest without drawing attention from the entire cabin, though attention had already gathered anyway. Marcus turned his head slightly toward him, acknowledging his presence without shifting his posture, his hands still resting on the closed laptop, fingers relaxed, not gripping, not tense, simply present, and there was something in the way he looked at Andrew that suggested he was not seeing a supervisor, not even seeing an airline representative, but rather observing another layer of the same decision being reinforced. Andrew continued, "We do need to ask for your cooperation so that we can ensure all passengers are accommodated appropriately." The phrasing careful, neutral, yet the direction unmistakable, and behind him, Claire stood a half step back now, her earlier confidence replaced with a quieter watchfulness, as if the responsibility had been transferred and she was no longer certain how the moment would unfold. Daniel shifted slightly, adjusting his jacket, his expression settling back into expectation, the brief flicker of uncertainty gone now that a higher authority had entered the exchange, and he glanced once toward Marcus, then toward Andrew, as if confirming that the situation was finally aligning with what he had anticipated from the start. Marcus inhaled slowly, not deeply, just enough to mark a transition, and for the first time since the request had been made, he moved with intention, not to stand, not to gather his belongings, but to adjust his position in the seat, settling more fully into it, his back resting evenly, his shoulders squared, a small movement that carried a quiet finality, as if he were not preparing to leave but preparing to remain. His gaze lifted to meet Andrew's directly, steady and unhurried. And when he spoke, his voice remained the same calm, measured tone that had defined every word so far. "I am already accommodated," he said, each word clear, evenly spaced, not defensive, not raised, but firm in a way that did not invite reinterpretation, and the simplicity of the statement seemed to catch Andrew for a fraction of a second, just enough to disrupt the flow of a conversation that had been expected to follow a predictable path. The engines continued their steady hum, the faint vibration beneath their feet unchanged, the aircraft moving forward at hundreds of miles per hour while inside. The moment tightened, narrowing around a single seat, a single decision, and a single man who had not raised his voice, had not stood up, had not escalated, yet had not moved. And in that stillness, something intangible began to shift, subtle but undeniable, as if the balance of the situation was no longer resting where everyone had assumed it would. Andrew held Marcus's gaze for a moment longer than expected, just long enough for the edges of his composure to tighten, not visibly enough for most to notice, but enough to shift the rhythm of the exchange, and he glanced briefly toward Claire before returning his attention forward, recalibrating, choosing his next words more carefully. "Sir, I understand your position," he said, his tone still controlled but now carrying a firmer edge. "However, we are asking for your cooperation in order to resolve this matter quickly and respectfully." The emphasis subtle but deliberate, as if the timeline itself had become part of the pressure. Marcus did not respond right away, his silence no longer passive but active, shaping the space between them, and he reached forward slowly, not toward the aisle, not toward his belongings, but toward the seat pocket in front of him, retrieving his boarding pass with a smooth, unhurried motion. The paper crisped between his fingers as he glanced at it once more, not because he needed to confirm anything, but because the act itself seemed to underline what had already been said. He held it up slightly, not in defiance, not as a challenge, simply as a fact made visible, and then lowered it back down, placing it gently on the closed laptop, aligning it with quiet precision, as if even the smallest details deserved order. Daniel exhaled again, louder this time, his patience thinning into something less controlled, and he shifted his weight, one hand resting on the top of his carry-on, fingers tapping once against the handle. "This is becoming unnecessary," he said, his voice carrying further now, reaching beyond the immediate row, drawing in more attention, and a few heads turned more openly, the boundary between private and public dissolving. Andrew's posture straightened further, his authority settling into place as he stepped slightly closer, not invading Marcus's space, but narrowing it. "Sir," he said, the word now firmer, less flexible, "if you are unwilling to comply, we may need to explore alternative options before departure." The implication clear without being stated, a line drawn in language that avoided direct confrontation while still delivering consequence. The cabin seemed to tighten around the words, the hum of the engines unchanged yet somehow louder against the silence that followed, and Marcus's eyes lifted again, steady, unwavering, meeting Andrew's without hesitation. And there was no anger there, no visible frustration, only a quiet certainty that did not shift under pressure. His hand moved once more, this time to the laptop, not opening it, but resting on it briefly, as if grounding himself again. And when he spoke, his voice remained calm, measured, but now carried something else beneath it, something that did not need volume to be felt. "Then let us be clear," he said, each word deliberate, evenly spaced. "I am not refusing to cooperate. I am refusing to be reassigned without cause." And the distinction hung in the air, precise, undeniable, forcing the conversation into a space where it could no longer rely on vague language or assumed authority. Andrew's expression shifted, just slightly, the certainty in his approach encountering resistance that did not escalate, but did not yield, and behind him, Claire's eyes flickered again, her earlier confidence replaced now with something closer to concern, while Daniel's jaw tightened, the ease he had carried into the moment beginning to fracture under the unexpected resistance. Around them, the cabin remained still, but the stillness had changed, no longer passive observation, but something closer to awareness, as if the passengers were no longer watching a routine adjustment, but a moment that was not following the script they had unconsciously expected, and Marcus remained exactly where he was, composed, grounded, his presence steady against the quiet pressure building around him, as if the seat beneath him had become more than just a place, but a position that could not be moved without consequence. For a moment, no one spoke, and the silence that followed Marcus's words felt different from the earlier pauses, heavier, more deliberate, as if the cabin itself had settled into a kind of awareness that something important had shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in a way that could not be undone. Andrew's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, his gaze holding steady, but now there was calculation behind it, not just procedure, and he glanced briefly toward the front again, where another crew member stood partially obscured, already watching more closely than before, as if waiting for a signal that had not yet been given. Marcus remained still, his posture unchanged, his breathing even, the faint rise and fall of his chest steady against the soft fabric of his shirt, and his hand rested lightly on the edge of the laptop, not gripping, not tense, just present, grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the subtle tension building around him. A soft chime sounded somewhere overhead, a routine system tone that usually went unnoticed, but in this moment it seemed to echo more clearly, punctuating the stillness, and a passenger two rows back shifted in their seat, the rustle of fabric unusually loud, while another quietly set down a plastic cup, the small click against the tray table carrying farther than it should have. Claire's eyes moved between Andrew and Marcus, her earlier certainty now replaced with a quiet uncertainty she could not mask, and she adjusted her stance slightly, as if unsure whether to step forward again or remain where she was, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, fingers interlaced just a little tighter than before. Daniel, standing just behind Andrew now, let out a slow breath, longer this time, his impatience no longer hidden behind politeness, his gaze fixed on Marcus with a growing edge of frustration, as if the situation had lingered far beyond what he considered acceptable, and he shifted his weight again, the leather of his shoes pressing lightly against the carpeted aisle, a small movement that carried a quiet insistence. Marcus finally moved, but not in the way anyone expected, his hand lifting slowly from the laptop, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket with a smooth, unhurried motion, the kind of movement that suggested intention rather than reaction, and for a brief second, the surrounding tension sharpened, attention narrowing onto that single gesture, as if everyone present was waiting to see what would emerge from it. He withdrew a slim, dark phone, its surface catching the overhead light for a fraction of a second before settling back into his hand, and he turned it slightly, the screen lighting up with a soft glow that reflected faintly in his eyes, his thumb moving once across it, not hurried, not hesitant, just precise. He did not raise the phone to his ear immediately, did not announce what he was doing, but the simple act of holding it there, poised, seemed to alter the balance in a way that was subtle yet undeniable, and Andrew noticed it, his eyes flicking briefly to the device, then back to Marcus's face, something in his expression shifting as if a new variable had entered. A situation he had believed was already contained. Marcus looked up again, his gaze calm, steady, meeting Andrew's without strain, and in that quiet exchange, without a word spoken, something passed between them, not agreement, not confrontation, but recognition that the moment had moved beyond what it had been just seconds before, and that whatever came next would not follow the same predictable path that had brought them here. Marcus did not rush the motion, his thumb resting lightly against the edge of the phone as the screen remained illuminated, casting a soft, controlled glow against his palm, and for a brief moment, he simply held it there, not as a threat, not as a display, but as a quiet acknowledgement that the situation had reached a point where silence alone would no longer carry the weight it needed. Andrew's eyes lingered on the device for half a second longer than before, and something in his posture shifted, subtle but unmistakable, the rigid certainty easing just enough to allow uncertainty to enter, while Claire's gaze followed the same line, her earlier composure now replaced with a careful attentiveness, as if she were recalibrating her understanding of who Marcus might be. Daniel, however, did not adjust, his expression tightening further, his patience worn thin by a situation that refused to resolve in the expected direction, and he let out a quiet, controlled breath that carried more frustration than before, his eyes narrowing slightly as he watched Marcus with a growing disbelief. Marcus finally moved the phone, lifting it just slightly, his thumb pressing once against the screen, initiating a call with a single, precise motion, and though no sound had yet come from the device, the act itself shifted the atmosphere, as if an invisible boundary had just been crossed. The line connected quickly, and Marcus brought the phone to his ear, his posture still relaxed, his voice when he spoke no louder than before, but now carrying a different kind of clarity, one that did not seek permission or approval. "Good afternoon," he said, the words simple, composed, followed by a brief pause as he listened, his gaze drifting momentarily toward the window, the pale sky stretching endlessly beyond the glass. before returning to the space in front of him. Andrew remained still, but his attention was now fully fixed on Marcus, no longer dividing between procedure and outcome. While Claire's hands tightened slightly at her waist, her fingers pressing together as if bracing for something she could not yet define, Marcus continued, his tone unchanged, steady and precise. I am currently on board Flight 728, scheduled departure at 14:30. Another pause, his expression calm, almost neutral, yet the quiet authority in his voice began to register in the space around him, subtle but undeniable. Daniel shifted again, a faint crease forming between his brows, his earlier certainty beginning to fracture, not dramatically, but enough to disrupt the rhythm he had relied on. And he glanced briefly toward Andrew, as if expecting intervention, but Andrew did not move. Marcus's next words came with the same measured cadence. There appears to be a discrepancy regarding seating allocation, he said, choosing each word with care, not exaggerated, not emotional, simply factual, and as he spoke, the language itself seemed to change the nature of the situation, reframing it from a simple request into something more structured, more consequential. A faint response came through the phone, inaudible to those nearby, but Marcus listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his posture unchanged, and when he spoke again, there was a slight shift, not in volume, but in finality. Yes, he said, a single word, followed by a brief pause. Then, I would recommend that we review all pending allocations before departure. The phrasing calm, deliberate, yet carrying a weight that extended beyond the immediate moment. Andrew's expression changed then, just enough to be seen, the certainty replaced with something closer to concern, while Claire's eyes widened slightly, her earlier assumptions dissolving into a realization she had not anticipated, and Daniel, standing just behind them, no longer looked certain at all. The quiet confidence he had carried into the moment now replaced with a hesitation that had not been there before. Marcus lowered the phone slightly, not ending the call, but holding it just away from his ear, his gaze lifting once more to meet Andrew's, calm, steady, unchanged, yet now carrying something unmistakable, something that had not been visible before, as if the balance of the situation had shifted completely, without a single raised voice. And the silence that followed was no longer empty, but filled with a realization that could not be undone. The silence did not break all at once. It shifted, like pressure releasing slowly from a sealed space, and Andrew's eyes moved again, this time not to Marcus, not to Daniel, but toward the front of the cabin where a quiet vibration of activity had begun, subtle at first, a flight attendant stepping quickly into the galley, another reaching for an intercom panel without speaking, and then Andrew's own pocket buzzed, a small, contained sound that seemed to cut through the stillness more sharply than anything that had come before. He hesitated for a fraction of a second before retrieving his phone, his fingers slightly less precise now as he glanced down at the screen, and whatever he saw there changed something immediately, not dramatically, but unmistakably, his posture adjusting, the rigid controls softening into something more cautious, more aware. Claire noticed it at once, her gaze locking onto Andrew's expression, searching for confirmation of what she was beginning to understand but had not yet fully accepted, and Daniel, standing just behind them, leaned forward slightly, his earlier impatience now edged with something else, something closer to uncertainty, though he did not yet name it. Andrew stepped half a pace back, creating a small but significant distance between himself and Marcus, and when he spoke, his voice was still controlled, but the tone had shifted, the authority no longer pushing forward but pulling inward, recalibrating. Sir, he began, then paused, the word hanging differently now, less directive, more careful, and he glanced once more at his phone before continuing. It seems there may have been an oversight, the phrasing deliberate, chosen to soften what could not be undone. Marcus lowered his phone completely now, ending the call with a quiet motion, his expression unchanged, his posture still grounded, and he placed the device gently on top of the laptop beside the boarding pass, aligning it with the same quiet precision as before, as if nothing in the moment required urgency from him. Daniel's gaze moved quickly between Andrew and Marcus, his earlier certainty now clearly fractured. What is going on? He asked, his voice lower than before, no longer projecting, but searching, and Andrew did not answer him immediately. His attention fixed instead on Marcus, reassessing, recalculating, as if the man seated before him had become someone entirely different in the span of a single minute. Claire stepped forward slightly, her voice softer now, stripped of its earlier rehearsed firmness. "Mr. Ellington," she said, the name landing carefully, respectfully as if testing the weight of it in the air, and the shift was immediate, unmistakable, the use of his name changing the dynamic in a way that no instruction or request had been able to do before. Marcus looked at her, calm, steady, acknowledging without reacting, and Andrew followed her lead, his tone adjusting fully now. "Mr. Ellington, we sincerely apologize for the inconvenience," he said, the words measured, formal, but carrying a genuine edge of urgency beneath them. "Your seat assignment is, of course, correct, and you are welcome to remain where you are." The reversal complete, though delivered as if it had always been the intention. Daniel's expression tightened, confusion now overtaking certainty. "I was told this seat was being reassigned," he said, his voice no longer steady, and Andrew turned toward him briefly, his response polite but distant. "There has been a clarification," he said, offering nothing more. The explanation intentionally limited. The cabin, which had held its breath for so long, began to exhale in small, quiet ways, a shift in posture here, a glance exchanged there, the subtle release of tension that followed the resolution of something unspoken but deeply felt. And Marcus remained exactly as he had been, seated, composed, unmoved, his presence unchanged despite the complete reversal unfolding around him, as if the outcome had never been in doubt, only the moment in which it would be revealed. The cabin settled into a new kind of quiet, not the tense stillness from before, but something softer, heavier, as if the moment had passed, yet left something behind that no one could quite ignore. And Marcus remained exactly where he was, seated upright, his hands resting calmly on the closed laptop and the neatly aligned boarding pass and phone, his posture unchanged, his expression steady, as if nothing about the last several minutes required adjustment from him. Claire stepped back slowly, her movements careful now, almost deliberate in their restraint, and Andrew gave a small nod, more to himself than to anyone else, before turning slightly toward the aisle, signaling without words that the situation was resolved, that there would be no further requests, no more pressure, only a quiet retreat from what had just unfolded. Daniel did not move right away, his hand still resting on the handle of his carry-on. But the confidence that had anchored him earlier was no longer there, replaced by something less certain, less defined, and he glanced once more at Marcus, as if searching for something he could not name, before finally stepping back, creating space where moments ago he had expected to take it. A flight attendant further down the aisle resumed a small task, adjusting a compartment latch, the soft click marking the return of routine, and a passenger near the window lifted their phone briefly, then lowered it again, as if deciding that whatever had just happened was not something that needed to be captured, only remembered. The overhead lights remained steady, casting the same even glow across polished surfaces and quiet faces, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that could not be reset, as if everyone present had witnessed something simple on the surface yet layered beneath, something about who is seen, who is heard, and who is asked to move. Marcus reached forward at last, not in reaction, not in urgency, but with the same calm precision that had defined every movement, opening his laptop again, the screen lighting up softly, the cursor still blinking where it had been left, and he resumed typing as if the interruption had been nothing more than a brief pause in a longer line of thought, his focus returning not to the people around him, but to the work in front of him. The engines continued their steady hum, the aircraft preparing to push back from the gate, and the subtle vibrations beneath the floor signaled the return to motion. Forward, constant, indifferent to what had just taken place, yet carrying everyone within it regardless. No one spoke to Marcus again, not Claire, not Andrew, not Daniel, and no apology was repeated, no explanation offered, because the shift had already occurred, complete and irreversible. And in that quiet, in the absence of further words, something clearer than any statement settled into the space between them. Marcus did not look up, did not acknowledge the eyes that occasionally drifted in his direction, did not seek recognition or reaction. He simply remained, grounded, present, exactly where he had been from the beginning. And as the plane began to move slowly along the runway, the city stretching out beyond the windows in long lines of concrete and light, the cabin carried forward not just passengers, but the quiet imprint of a moment where nothing loud had happened. Yet everything had changed.